All right. So our session is now in order, and my name is Ellen Widmer. I'm on the committee, the Amos Fortune Forum Committee. I am not moderator tonight. I'm just here to make announcements. The real moderator is sitting over here, Steve Gelbach. He's the father-in-law of the speaker, and so I'm going to yield to him in just a minute, but I have a very few announcements to make. First, I wanted to thank Heather and Dick Ames for a beautiful dinner that took place just before that. And I'm also supposed to thank a person for the flowers, but I can't actually do that tonight. Steve Gelbach is going to finish that announcement after he comes to this podium. But I want you to know, in discussing the floral arrangement, I want you to understand that every floral arrangement we have had so far this season has something to do with the talk. And if you're like me and you have to, your eyesight isn't that great, and I usually sit maybe 2 or 3 rows back, I wouldn't know that. But for those of you in the back, after the talk, come and check out the floral arrangement, and you will see that there's a definite connection to the talk. And we appreciate Bonnie at Cold Garden for all of that work. I also wanted to thank Betsy Trimble, who organizes our receptions each week. And tonight's host is Ilona and the ladies of the First Church, who are putting on a reception right after this gathering over there in the building. You'll see everybody will migrate over there as soon as the talk is over at 9 o'clock, and you can meet the speaker and talk to her directly. Then I also wanted to thank all of our corporate sponsors and our individual sponsors, without whom we could not be able to continue this important and vibrant forum of ideas, which has been free for all to attend since the founding of the series in 1946. And therefore, we have to ask your help. There'll be begging bowls going in and out the door, so if you have some extra money you could spare to help us out a little bit, that would be very welcome, but there's no requirement that anyone pay. And then anyone in the audience that has suggestions for us, for speakers for the future, or any such thing, please come to me or anyone else on the committee, and we will definitely take your suggestions to heart. You also have a chance to write your ideas down on the postcards, which are there on your seats. So with that, I'm going to yield this podium to Steve Gelbach, who's going to introduce Hahrie Han.
Thank you, Ellen. The reason that Ellen did not disclose the donor of the flowers is because Ellen is the donor of the flowers. And she couldn't figure out a way to do that that didn't sound a little self-serving. But I will echo her request that you come up and take a look at this, because it's really quite clever. The flowers. Let's go back 16 years, summer of 2009. And there is some good news and some bad news and some usual news. The bad news is that the United States has just been in the Great Recession. 2007, 2008, we were up at an unemployment rate at that moment in time of almost 10%, and it was just beginning to turn around a little. The usual news was that the Red Sox were 10 games behind the Yankees, and the Yankees went on to win the pennant, but that's neither here nor there. The good news is that the United States had just elected its first African-American president. And this was an event of really historic moment. So the talk at the Amos Fortune Forum exactly 16 years ago was called Activism in the 2008 Campaign. And I'll just quote from the brochure of that evening. The Obama campaign represented a watershed moment in American history, renewing interest in how people come together to make change. And this talk was presented by a young assistant professor from Wellesley College who grew up in Texas. Hook 'em horns, is that? And then sampled the country's two coasts as a college undergraduate at Harvard and a doctoral student at Stanford. Subsequently, she has continued her peregrination. I love peregrination. Isn't that a wonderful word? At University of California at Santa Barbara, where she was an endowed chair, then back east to Johns Hopkins University, where she is now the first head of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. It was founded by a grant of $150 million from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. And its purpose is to develop a multidisciplinary academic and public forum dedicated to strengthening global democracy. Some of you have heard of democracy. By improving and expanding civic engagement and inclusive dialogue, and by supporting inquiry that leads to real-world change. So this has been a tremendous asset to Johns Hopkins, as has its leader. Added to all of this, tonight's speaker has, during this time, organized two rather marvelous offspring. With at least some success, she has managed a husband who is also a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University, and, according to the aforementioned offspring, a world-class purveyor of bad dad jokes. So, without any more from me, let me introduce, or reintroduce, 16 years later, Hahrie Han, who will talk about her new book, appropriately and interestingly called Undivided.
Well, thank you. I am really excited for the conversation tonight. Thank you to the Amos Fortune Foreign Committee for inviting me back to come and do this talk, to Heather and Richard for such a lovely dinner at your home, which was really wonderful and always a pleasure. And also particularly to my father and mother-in-law, Carol and Steve, who not only for the lovely introduction, but also for introducing me to this wonderful community in Jaffrey, which I never would have found, I think, without having the fortune of marrying into this wonderful family. And I'm especially delighted, I have to just say, that I've had the privilege of talking about Undivided over the course of the past year since the book has come out in lots of different audiences all over the world. But this is the first time I think I'm doing a book talk where my children are both here. And so I'm sure that they want nothing more than to hear their mom talk on a Friday night. But I'm especially grateful to be able to talk about the project in front of them. So what I wanted to do tonight is talk about this book called Undivided, which is the story of a group of people who are fighting for racial justice within the third largest evangelical megachurch in America. And so this is a church that is now a 50,000 person church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I started working with them in 2015 and 2016 when they were at the time about a 28,000 person church. And was really, and was really kind of surprised, for a variety of reasons which I can talk about, to know that there was a group of people who were people of faith from within the community who were really fighting to try to realize their vision of racial solidarity, both in their church and in their community in Cincinnati. And so I began to kind of follow that story, and what the book does is kind of traces the arc of 4 particular people who were all people in this church community who got involved in this work of racial justice. And it kind of traces the arc of their work from 2016 to about 2022, 2023, which I don't know if you guys remember, but it was kind of a tumultuous period in American politics. You know, it went from the first Trump administration to the pandemic to George Floyd to all these different kind of things. And the book kind of tells the story of how they navigated all of that. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that project, but I thought that I would start just by saying a little bit about how I got into this work, because I found the project very much by happenstance. As Steve said, I grew up in Texas. I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants there. My family's not evangelical. We weren't even really very political, so it wasn't something that we paid attention to at all. But I first became interested in politics when I was an undergrad at Harvard, and I got unwittingly involved in student activism in a fight that we lost with the university. But you know, I think the reason why that really drew me in, because that was the first experience when I got involved in activism as a college student, that I had the experience of what it felt like to be a person acting with dignity in the public sphere. And even though we lost the fight that we were in, kind of winning or losing was actually incidental to what that experience was of identifying a problem, learning to work with my peers to try to figure out solutions to it, and then putting our whole hearts into trying to put our hands on the levers of change. And I think there was a way in which that experience was, like so intoxicating enough that after college, that's what got me interested in politics. I went down to Washington, D.C. I worked in Capital P, partisan politics for a couple of years, and then eventually went to graduate school to study it. And I think one way to kind of trace the arc of some of the work that Steve described, but just to kind of characterize the arc of all the work that I've done, is that it's an effort to try to understand like what made that experience, that early experience that I had of collective action so magically intoxicating, and then to learn how to recreate how to make that more possible for more people. And so Undivided was a project that I came into, I think, through that lens. I haven't lived in Cincinnati, I'm not from Ohio, but I was in Cincinnati. I first was drawn to Cincinnati in 2016 because someone had told me about a really unusual ballot initiative campaign that had happened. So if you remember the 2016 election, it was Clinton versus Trump, right? It was the first Trump election. Trump won Ohio by about 8 percentage points. And in the same year that Trump won Ohio, the city of Cincinnati had a ballot initiative on the ballot where they were trying to figure out if they could convince voters to raise taxes on themselves in order to fund universal preschool for low-income children. And if you know the demographics of Cincinnati, Cincinnati has some of the highest rates of intergenerational poverty in the country. It also has, and it's very racialized poverty. So raising taxes on themselves in order to fund universal preschool for the poorest kids in the city basically meant it was a wealth transfer from wealthier white communities to poorer black communities. And that ballot initiative passed in 2016 by the largest margin of any new tax in Cincinnati history. And so it passed by like 24 percentage points. And so as a political scientist, I was like, this is a crazy story, right? Like, how is it possible that that happened where in the same year that Trump got elected, you had this ballot initiative that had this very progressive wealth transfer from wealthier to poor communities kind of happen, and why did voters vote that in? So I was in Cincinnati just trying to understand issue 44 and trying to understand like how was it that they built this coalition in the city in this tumultuous, like highly polarized election period to pass this election, to pass this ballot initiative. So I go to Cincinnati, I'm talking to people, and everyone keeps saying like, oh, well, like there's this and there's that, but there's this church, and they kept sending all these volunteers. And if you've ever kind of, studied political campaigns, like every campaign has a church who sends volunteers, but usually they mean like there's 2 volunteers, right? And I think in the book I kind of wrote, like usually it's like, 2 people with like a kind of lonely box of saltines in a basement, making a couple phone calls, and that's what they mean by the church sending volunteers. But it turned out that as I dug into this story, it was, 200 or 300 volunteers that were Black and that were white, that were coming week after week after week to make phone calls on behalf and door knock and all the other things that you do on behalf of this ballot initiative. And then I learned that most of these volunteers, the vast majority of them, all came from this evangelical megachurch in the city. And at that time, I had not known anything about evangelicalism in America except for what I read in the New York Times, and I had just read, all these stories about how 8 in 10 white evangelicals had voted for Trump, and that there's all these stories about the ways in which these churches are kind of crucibles of, all kinds of things, white Christian nationalism and so on. And so I was really puzzled to understand how was it that this church was animating so many volunteers to come get involved in this initiative. And that's what kind of drove me to get involved in it. And so I went and I started digging around, and it turns out that almost all the volunteers who had come from the church's name called Crossroads, that had come from Crossroads, had taken part in a program called Undivided. And Undivided was a racial justice program that had been started by the highest ranking Black pastor in the church in 2015. And it was a program that took thousands of people in the church community through a racial justice program and then tried to inspire them to get involved in working on racial justice issues in their community. And so that program kind of became the core of what the book was about. And so I want to read you a little passage about the book that kind of gives you a sense of how the program worked, but I want to put it a little bit into context first. And so when I first started doing research in this, I didn't know anything pretty much at all about evangelical churches or anything like that, but I learned a lot from them. And so a couple data points that I'll throw out to kind of put this into context is, I think one of the things that I learned from this project is that I think the way in which white evangelicalism is understood in the media actually obscures a lot of the heterogeneity that exists in the community. So it's absolutely true that there are parts of the white evangelical community that are very conservative, that are kind of bastions of white Christian nationalism and the things that often get reported. But it's absolutely also true that there are large parts of the white evangelical community that are very different. And I think that as one of the largest megachurches in America, Crossroads kind of contained all of that within the community. And so to give a few data points to put this into context, usually if I ask people when I'm doing talks like this, what is the most politically active religious group in America? Does anyone have a guess? What's the most politically active religious group in America? Southern Baptists? Other guesses? Jewish. Okay. So the most politically active religious group in America actually is atheists. Okay. But you can argue with that. You can say that's not actually a religious group. Fine. All right. The second most active religious group in America are white liberal Christians. And white liberal Christians are almost twice as active as white conservative Christians and Black Christians, and non-Christians also. And this is if you measure it by kind of the amount of activity that people partake in, from voting and donating money to attending marches or being part of groups in their churches. It's there's different kind of things. But what's different is that conservative Christians tend to have organized their activity into churches where they're able to project a smaller volume of activity onto a broader political landscape, whereas a lot of the activity among white liberal Christians tends to be more individualistic. So it's not organized in a way that projects it onto the same kind of landscape. And so that's just one kind of way of saying that part of what was interesting to me about this project was not just trying to understand how it was that this community was able to bring people together on one of the most intractable issues in America, but also how it worked as an organization and as a church, and how it was that in a particularly polarized time, in a very polarized state, they were able to hold together. They had white congregants and Black congregants. They're about 80% white, 20% non-white. They had Republicans and Democrats, pro-life, pro-choice, Trump voters, non-Trump voters. They had all different kinds of people in that community. And so part of what I want to try to understand is how is the church able to do that? The second thing that I learned that I didn't know is that megachurches in America are the growth edge of Christianity. And so a megachurch is typically defined as a church that is 2,000 people or more. The average the last data, that period that we have data from is like 2015 to 2020. The average megachurch in America, I don't have the exact numbers right, but I'm in the ballpark, I think has like 6,000 members and an annual budget of about $6 million a year. 96% of that budget comes from individual donations, right? And so that means that people are not only attending these churches, but they're giving actively to them. And the average megachurch grew by 34%, actually the median megachurch grew by 34% in the last period that we have data. So, they're big, they're growing, and people are actively participating in them. And so I was also interested in kind of just understanding, and I should also say, by the way, we could have a whole conversation about the theological value of megachurches, and that's like almost a separate conversation, about it. So there's a big debate about whether or not that's a good way to actually pastor people into relationship with God, and so I'm going to bracket that for a second. But regardless of what you think about that from a theological perspective, I think it is true that these churches are drawing people in, and people are flocking to them. And so as a political scientist, like one of the things I was interested in is trying to understand that phenomenon, right? Like what was happening in these churches. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of sense of Crossroads, and then I'll kind of give you a section of the book. So Crossroads, as I said, I'm not sure exactly where it is right now, but at one point it was the third largest megachurch in America. It's grown tremendously in the time period that I've been working with them. So they started out as about a 28,000 person church when I first started working with them. They were about a 35,000 person church by the time I finished the book. It took me 7 years. And then they're now a 50,000 person church. And when I give those numbers, those are the numbers of people who show up in person each week. And so they get about 500,000 people that tune in online, right? So they have a scale that outstrips any of our other political organizations, and they're able to get those numbers of people to come together each week. And the head pastor in Crossroads is a white pastor, a guy named Brian Tome, who is a founding pastor of Crossroads. The person who started Undivided is one of the most popular pastors in the church. He's the highest ranking black pastor. His name is Chuck Mingo. And Chuck started Undivided when, in 2015, there was a police shooting of an unarmed black man in Cincinnati that kind of brought the debate about national policing that was happening to Cincinnati. And Chuck stood up on stage one Sunday and said, I feel called to be a voice on racial issues in our city. And he knew he'd get some pushback from certain parts of the church, but he also felt like he had to preach about that, and he preached about that. He was someone who had grown up in the black church, and so it was very unusual for him to be in a church that wasn't preaching actively about race. And so he kind of delivers that sermon, kind of thinking it'll be like one sermon and then it'll move on, but he got an outpouring of like thousands of people who reached out to him and said, if you're going to do something about this, then I want to be a part of it. And once he realized that people were hungry for something around this question of racial divisions in Cincinnati, he eventually built this program that became Undivided. And so that was sort of the context within which Undivided started. And so what I thought that I would do is read a passage of the book to kind of give you a sense a little bit of some of how it worked, and then kind of say a little bit about what I think some of the broad lessons are that come out of it, and then see where the discussion goes from there. But so the way the book is organized, there's 4 main characters in the book that I trace through their journey through Undivided. The 4 characters are Chuck Mingo, who's the black pastor, a white woman named Jess, a white man named Grant, and then a black woman named Sandra. And Chuck is a pastor, so he's the person who started Undivided, and so the book kind of tells a story of how he was brought into it, and then kind of the ups and downs that he experienced in trying to build a program around racial justice within the context of his church and during that time period. Grant, Sandra, and Jess are all people who were congregants in the Crossroads community, and for a variety of reasons felt compelled to participate, sign up, raise their hands and participate in Undivided, and then each had, different varying levels of experience, positive experience within the program, and then got involved in it. The way Undivided works is it's a 6-week program. It takes people through a 6-week curriculum around racial justice, and then it invites people into ongoing activity following that program. And so the first half of the book is called Agitation, which is about how people get compelled to kind of join a program like that, and then what their experience within that 6-week curriculum is. And then the second half of the book is called Backlash, because all of the characters, when they begin to kind of try to carry the work of anti-racism into their own lives, experience backlash in different ways. And so the second half of the book kind of explores the question of how is it that they navigate that. And then just to kind of give you a scale of the program, the first time that Crossroads ran the program, they had 1,200 people go through the program. So they took 1,200 people through the 6-week curriculum, and the way that it works, which is really typical for a lot of programming in evangelical megachurches, is they would organize people into small groups of about 8 to 10 people, and those small groups are kind of the heart of the relationships that people built with each other. And so the section that I thought that I'd read to you is a section about Jess, who's the white woman that was brought into the program, and it gives you a little bit of a sense of her background for how it was that, like what her kind of background was that brought her into the program. And then I'll read a section that sort of talks about how she kind of lived it out at the end. And then the one thing I just want to say before I read this section is that, so Jess grew up in a family where she had her father who was literally a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And so there's some strong language that's used in this section to describe her background. And so I just want to give a fair warning about that. Okay, I'm realizing now this is one difference from 16 years ago is I can't see the pages well. I should have brought my glasses up here. So 16 years ago, I would have been able to see the page. Okay, but I'm pretty sure I can do this. Okay, so this is a section on Jess. The inexorable, actually, you know what? I think I need my glasses. Sorry. I'm not used to this. I just started having to use readers for the first time this year, and so I'm not used to having to do it when I bring the glasses when I do talks. But here we go. Okay. All right. The inexorable force of social sanctioning meant Jess's parents never detected any contradictions in the entangled relationship between the Ku Klux Klan and their childhood churches. People in their circle told them that integrating white supremacist politics with their faith in God was normal, and they never thought to question it. Jess recalled hearing stories about her parents attending Baptist services in Florida for her mom and Southern California for her dad on Sunday morning, and then staying for a potluck lunch. As people digested their sandwiches and coffee, the men would participate in a Klan meeting. Women socialized and children played while men sat around in their Sunday church clothes discussing ways to advance an agenda of white supremacy. Pursuing an agenda of white power thus felt natural to Jess's father. He tattooed the word white in large scripted font on the back of his left tricep and the word power onto his right triceps. He deliberately wore muscle shirts and tank tops in public to ensure everyone could see the words. Like all children, Jess turned her head like a sunflower toward the light of her parents' love, even if it was darkened by shadows of hate. Throughout her childhood in Florida and then Ohio, her father worked assiduously to instill a fear of being alone with Black people in Jess and her sister. When Jess was around 8 or 9 years old, she asked the pastor at her family's church what would happen to her Catholic friends when they died. He told her they would go to hell. It scared her. She was learning a social order that put white Protestants on top and condemned everyone else. She thus learned a complex architecture of judgment and reward that carefully parsed the different groups of people to maintain the racial order. Hierarchy was a rule, God was a judge, and hell was a stick. As a child, Jess felt like deviating from the social order would send her to hell. But it confused her. Her family could not afford to live in the suburban enclaves that enclosed families in a wrapper of whiteness. The working class neighborhoods where they lived and the schools Jess attended were always racially and religiously diverse. Catholics, Blacks, Latinos were her friends, classmates, and teachers. They weren't scary or undisciplined or lazy like the adults around her told her they would be. But she put her confusion into a box and tried as much as possible to bury it, focusing instead on being a decent kid. In high school, Jess became addicted to opioids and heroin. It wasn't until she became sober in prison that she dug up that box of confusion and reconsidered questions of the social order. In the Ohio State Penitentiary where Jess served her time, she befriended a racially mixed group of women. She began to ask questions. Why, she wondered, did the guards force the Black women but not the white women to shave their heads? To rethink her orientation toward race and racism in America, Jess first had to reconsider her orientation to God. She had to let go of the idea that upholding a racialized social order was part of being Christian. Could she differentiate between belief in God and belief in the social institutions, the churches, that taught her about God? So the book goes on to kind of talk about how Jess, sorry, now I can't see you. Talk about how Jess was participated in Undivided. She was part of a group where she had a really formative experience that opened her eyes to things that she had never really thought about. Like she never knew, about the ways in which things like, poverty or anything like that are racialized in America. And so it really animated her to begin to rethink the way that she oriented to race in her own life, and also within her own family. In the story, the book kind of talks about how she challenged some of the conversations that she was having with her parents and her uncle and different people who she was quite close to, and trying to get them to rethink the way that they oriented towards race. But she eventually, that started with a journey where she first found God in prison and then found Crossroads and Undivided. And then after she was released from prison, she eventually got a job working with the Ohio Department of Children and Family Services, which basically supports the foster care system in the state. And a lot of what she was doing in the foster care system, she was realizing is she was trying to live out some of the principles around Undivided and anti-racism in her own workplace, because that's obviously, it intersects a lot with the work that she was doing. And so this other section that I was gonna read kind of talks about what happened in the workplace when, this is after she had gone through Undivided. She had been sort of living this work for a couple years, and then George Floyd happened, and she was working in rural Ohio for the Department of Children and Family Services, had been outspoken on her views, and then had to kind of deal with the backlash that came from it. And so the question is sort of how she handles that. So I'll just read a section on that and then talk about what I think are some of the general lessons. Okay. June was not, this is June of 2020. George Floyd happened at the end of May of 2020, and so this is June of 2020. It's we're kind of a couple months into the pandemic at that point. George Floyd had just been killed, and there was all these protests that were happening around the country, including in Ohio where they lived. June was not an easy month for Jess. Her coworkers continued to ostracize her, and Jess thought she might have to look for another job. Each morning, she heard the whispered comments behind her back when she arrived at work. Each afternoon, she pretended not to notice the silence when she entered the lunchroom. On the days she had to be in the office, she was struck by the eerie feeling of unusual quiet. She tried to spend as much time as possible on the road. As a social worker, Jess constantly had to meet people in their homes. The pandemic had initially slowed her ability to do home visits, but she found a way to do them in COVID-safe ways. The visits, however, had their own precarity. Jess and her coworkers were keenly aware that most homes in rural Ohio likely had a gun. More and more often, Jess found the residents were high on methamphetamines. The potential for violence meant that the social workers, like Jess, often did home visits in the company of law enforcement officers. Because of these partnerships, Jess had gotten to know many of the officers in the county over the years. She had become friendly with two detectives in particular who often worked on cases with her. Her coworker's harsh reaction after seeing pictures of her at a George Floyd protest gave Jess pause when she contemplated the possibility of seeing the detectives, both of whom were white, on a site visit. She had always been vocal about her views, but she knew that the political turmoil over George Floyd might have created new ambiguities or new sensitivities. In the past, Jess has leveraged her friendship with the detectives and other officers of the criminal justice system to agitate for change. Quote, "A lot of times, I can just ask a quick question and say, hey, have you thought about this? Or why do we do it this way? Have you ever stepped back and looked at this?" She said she found ways to gently point out the inequities built into the system and was proud how she had helped people see things in a new light. She decided to reach out proactively to her two detective friends. Quote, "That's the thing Undivided taught me," she said. "If you build relationships with people, true relationships, you can have hard conversations. You can help people move their goalposts without moving yours. For me, Undivided was a springboard for that." She thought carefully about what she wanted to say and then texted them. Quote, "I just want you to know that I'm going to share some things on social media that you might disagree with. I believe in defunding the police. I think we have a policing problem in America, but I want you to know that I really respect you and the work that you do." Not too long afterward, Jess heard the familiar ding from her phone. She saw a text notification from one of the detectives. He sent back a laughing emoji. Quote, "You think we don't already know that about you?" he wrote. Jess laughed out loud, greatly relieved. It was the first time in several days that she had laughed audibly at work. Another ping came through. It was the other detective. Quote, "We know you, don't worry." Jess wrote back, "Well, if you want to unfollow me for a while, it's okay," she said. She saw the dots on her phone, and she knew that he was writing back right away. "It's okay," he wrote. "We know you're a good person." "Okay," she said, "but if there's anything I share that you want to talk about or you think I'm wrong about, come and talk to me." And so after that text exchange for a couple weeks, neither detective approaches Jess or comes and talks to her about anything. But then what happens one weekend is that there's a protest in one of the local towns in the rural county where they work that ended up going viral because there was a protest that was supposed to be, a protest for racial justice that then had a lot of counter-protesters who came in, and there was a clash between the protesters and the counter-protesters that kind of went viral on the media, and it was covered in the news. And a lot of the local residents who Jess worked with, both in her workplace and in the community, were part of the counter-protesters, and they were really confused because with all the rumors that they had heard from the news was that it was Antifa who was going to come in and perpetrate all this violence on their community. But then when they were there, like at the actual protest, it turned out that it was the counter-protesters who were the ones that started the violence. And so they come in and they're really confused. They don't know how to make sense of it. And so when Jess goes to work on Monday, then that's the first time the detectives kind of take her up on her offer to talk about it. And so it says, when Jess arrived at work the Monday morning following the violence, one of the detectives was waiting for her outside her office. "Somehow I knew you'd be here today," she said to him. "What happened yesterday?" he said. Like so many other people in the area, he had been reading about the violent tendencies of Black Lives Matter and the role the left played in fomenting violence. He was confused when he saw the counter-protesters instigate violence against peaceful marchers. "It doesn't fit," he said. In a society plagued by disinformation and distrust, researchers found that nothing more was more effective than personal experience in pushing people to see old things with new eyes. But they often needed others to make meaning of what they saw. Was the violence perpetrated in Bethel, the town, an outlier, or was it indicative of a bigger pattern? Jess smiled. She was frustrated that so many people, including her friends, believed the rumors they heard, but she was also happy that the detective trusted her enough to come and talk to her. He spent almost an hour in Jess's office that morning unpacking what had happened in Bethel. They discussed not only the local protests, but also the larger Black Lives Matter phenomenon. Jess shared more of her own story to push her friend to think more about his own biases. The conversation revealed a truth about Undivided, the on-ramps, and the justice team that Jess had previously understood. She originally thought the goal of the 6-week program was to inspire people's journey toward anti-racism. But Jess realized that the true impact of Undivided was not as a prejudice reduction program, but rather as a learning experience that inspired action. The program became impactful when people like her spread that learning through their social communities, transforming them in the process. And that's why the on-ramps, the justice team, all the work that followed, and the relationships like the one that Jess formed with some of the other characters became so important. People needed those friendships and those groups to sustain the courage to act. The program worked, in other words, not by converting committed white supremacists to anti-racism. Instead, it sought to find the, quote, other evangelicals, people like Jess and Sandra and Grant, who sense, as organizers said, a gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. At the most basic level, Undivided equipped these participants to understand both the interpersonal and systemic dimensions of racial injustice and offer them the tools to have difficult conversations around race. If the tinder lit, the program became a means for people to form relationships in which they could admit hard truths, take risks, inspire one another to action, and then hold one another accountable for their mistakes. By freeing people to choose on their own terms what they wanted to do, Undivided hoped to instigate a larger program of change. And so maybe I'll just sort of say, the last thing that I'll say is, in my day job, a lot of what I do is try to understand how these programs of social change work. And I spent a lot of time, I studied the Obama campaign, I studied lots of other social movements around the world, and have had the privilege of partnering with lots of grassroots organizations and so on. And some of the things that I learned working with Undivided and in the context of a megachurch like Crossroads, I think there's sort of 3 key lessons that I think come out of stories like the one that Jess experienced that are sort of relevant to some of those broader lessons. And so I'll sort of end with those, which is, so the first is, one of the mottos that Crossroads has that I think is it's such a pithy way of encapsulating, I think, a core insight, is this idea that belonging comes before belief, which is the idea that when you bring people into a community and into a relationship of belonging, then you're better able to shape the beliefs that they have. And what's interesting about that is that's part of how Crossroads as a church was able to hold together in one of the most contentious periods in America, a very politically, racially, economically diverse community, because they focused a lot on creating communities of belonging that brought everyone together regardless of what they believed. The challenge, I think, is that that so many of our political organizations are actually the opposite, right? They implicitly say belief comes before belonging, right? Like first, you have to show that you share our views on the environment. First, you have to show that you share our views on whatever before we're able to welcome you in. And so that was sort of like one lesson, is the power of kind of creating a community where belonging comes before belief. The second lesson that I'll sort of say is that one of the big challenges I think that a lot of community organizing or grassroots groups face is the challenge of how you get big enough to do the work. And one of the things I was interested in about Crossroads is how is it possible that they were able to do this work that had these powerful effects, but do it at the scale of a 535,000 person church. And I think the lesson that I learned there was that it was the power of the small groups that people like Jess and Sandra and Grant and some of the other characters were a part of, because what happened was that the small groups essentially acted like a honeycomb. So if you imagine like how a beehive looks, and it's got like a cellular structure where everyone is part of a small cell, but then those cells are all connected into a bigger structure. And so what ended up happening is that the scale came not by having like one person with a giant email list or something like that, but instead it came by having lots of people organized into these small self-governing groups that essentially acted like the cells. And so over the course of the time that I was doing research with these, like I remember a lot of people at some point would get mad at something Crossroads said, right? It was impossible to go through this like 7-year period in American history and not anger some people in your community based on things that the church did or didn't say. And a lot of times when that happened, I would go and talk to people and say like, oh, like how do you feel that Crossroads spoke out about this or didn't speak out about this, or how did this make you feel? And the answer they always, a lot of times that people would give is, well, my church is really my small group. And so that small group kind of created an intimate space where people felt like they could really negotiate difference in a way that was like grounded in real relationship. But because those small groups were all connected to each other, they were able to feel like the work was small and big at the same time. And so that was sort of the second lesson. And then the last lesson that I'll sort of say is that I think the other thing that I learned a lot from doing this work in Undivided, because another kind of way that I think about the book is that when I first started working on the project and people told me what Undivided was, and they're like, oh yeah, it's a 6-week curriculum, you kind of do these like small group activities, you learn about empathy and structural racism. Like it sounded just like every other DEI program that I've ever seen or been a part of. And most of those fail. Like if you look at the research on DEI programs, the vast majority of them are not effective. And I was trying to understand, like, well, what made this different? And I think part of what I learned about what made Undivided different relative to like your typical DEI program was that the invitation they were offering people was not to outsource the problem-solving strategy to somebody else, but instead to figure out how you solve your own problems, right? And so, I'm an employee of Johns Hopkins University, and I have to take lots of DEI trainings, as part of my job. Very important, But like, I take the training, and then usually what happens at the end, they sort of say like, if you're confronted with this kind of issue of harassment, here are the kind of legalistic things that you must do, and to respond, right? And so I'm basically kind of told how I should respond when complicated situations come up. What Undivided or Crossroads was doing instead is they were sort of saying, look, we're going to put you into a community of belonging in this like small group that you're a part of. We're going to teach you about really complicated things like empathy and racial injustice and structural inequity and all these different kind of things. And then we're going to invite you to figure out your own solutions, right? And what that meant was that as people were figuring out their own solutions, sometimes they were making terrible choices, and they were doing things that were really offensive to other people. But because they were embedded in this small group where they had like a set of real relationships, they were able to kind of navigate their way to different kind of solutions that were shared. And so then what ended up happening is that when people came out of the program, they owned the results of the change in a way that's really different than a lot of the other political environments that we're in. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot as I've been thinking about kind of what I learned from Undivided more broadly is kind of how we take some of those lessons about belonging, about scale, and about the kind of invitations that we offer people to other political communities. And so I'll just read one last passage about how I ended the book, and then I will stop. Okay. I started this project because I wanted to understand how people seeking to make change in something as complex as racial injustice persisted in the work and thought about what they could and should do. I wanted to observe if and how social change worked within an organization as complex, multifaceted, and unexpected as Crossroads. But as I got further into the research, I realized I was learning about much more. For the first time in my life, I developed a visceral understanding of the Christian concept of grace, the belief in unmerited favor from God. People in Undivided were willing to risk some of their deepest and most personal relationships to stand up for justice. This courage was not scripted by how-to manuals on anti-racism. Instead, it was rooted in a deeply personal commitment to a vision of the world that Jess, Sandra, Grant, and Chuck were desperate to see realized. And what is justice but unconditional love for and belief in the dignity of all people? In other words, what is justice but belief that everyone deserves grace? I remember Sister Lee teaching us about grace during my Roman Catholic traditions class in high school, but it wasn't until I spent 7 years studying Undivided that I really understood how grace can operate in the world. For the people I met in Undivided, their deep, abiding belief in God's grace manifested itself as a courage to fight for one another's dignity. I also began to understand anew what radical change really means. Most people use the word radical to refer to change that is extreme, but Jess loved a radical political Jesus who would upend the system and make it work for everybody. But the word radical actually comes from the idea of being rooted. Change is radical not when it is extreme, but when it makes change from the roots up. And what I learned from the people I met through Undivided was that making change not only had to alter the roots of an unjust system, but it also had to be rooted in real people. Systems as complex as racism in America do not change when disconnected people without any roots in a community yell a little louder or reshuffle a few priorities. Instead, it changes when people rooted in their own interests and connected to one another organize themselves into just structures that enable them to put their hands on the complex levers of change. So even as I remain unsure about what direction Undivided as a program or Crossroads as a church might take, I find myself believing that the march toward justice will find its resilience not necessarily in any one DEI program, any one church, or any one leader, but rather in the people who commit to grace, to one another's dignity, and to the work that it takes to create a world that recognizes it. So thank you. Do I do the questions? I think we have time for questions. I don't know. Okay. So I think we have time for questions if anyone has any questions. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So go ahead. Repeat the question. Okay, so the question is, what was it about this church that enabled a program like Undivided and one that was so effective to take root? Was it the people, the pastor, what was it about this community? So thank you for that. So two things that I'll say. First is, one of the things I feel like is really important to say whenever I talk about it is that I'm definitely not, and one of the things I try to be really clear about in the book is I'm definitely not saying that Undivided has cracked some formula, and if only everyone went out and did Undivided, we'd all scrub racism from our heart. That's not at all what I'm saying. If you kind of, part of what I was trying to sort of show in telling the stories of people is that the work was super messy, right? And is super rooted in the messy context of people's lives. And I tell the story of 4 people who are very animated by and then transformed by the program, but that's not a universal experience. And even as part of what the book shows, and also what has happened, as I continue to follow the program since the book was published, is the Crossroads relationship to Undivided also kind of tacks back and forth. There are times when they totally embrace it, and there are times when the church pushes the work away. And so it's a constant negotiation. But to answer your question more directly about what made it possible, so one of the things that, so I was raised in a Catholic church in Texas, and so I didn't know anything about Protestantism before I started doing this project, and the Catholic Church is there's a ton of rules, it's there's a pope and there's bishops and they tell you what to do and you sit and you stand and you say this and whatever, there's all these rules, right? And so then I go out and I start studying these Protestant churches, and it's the Wild West, right? There's no kind of denominational structure that sort of governs a lot of non-denominational evangelical megachurches. And so part of the way in which what that means is that Crossroads as an individual church had a lot of freedom to kind of interpret how they wanted to, what is the kind of community they wanted to build. And one of the things that Crossroads did from the beginning is really embrace a culture of risk. So one of the, like they had all these like pithy little sayings that they would say to try to like reinforce culture in the church. And so one of them was belonging comes before belief. But another thing they always used to say was, we have a big back door and you will be offended, right? And so they said that all the time, is that the pastors, when they preach, would always say, you're gonna be offended, right? And we're gonna do hard things. And if you think that being in relationship with God means that you're gonna come and have like an easy conversation every Sunday, then you're absolutely wrong. And then part of what they would say is that if you really wanna be in relationship with God, you have to do the hard work. And so they would kind of set expectations that way. And part of what I realized is that I think they actually really believed that from a theological perspective, but it also, from a political perspective, it gave them cover to be able to really push people and often say things that half the church is going to find really offensive. And so I think that culture of risk is part of what enabled this. The second thing I'll say is because they were so big, unlike a lot of small churches, they weren't worried about losing people. So the other thing they would say is, look, we have a big back door. And they'd say, look, if you don't like what you hear, you can always leave. And they would lose people sometimes based on what they said, but that freedom to be able to experiment and take risks meant that they were innovating on these kinds of programs in ways that other churches that were more cautious because they weren't able to take those kind of risks couldn't. So, yeah.
I don't know if this is an appropriate comment.
Yeah.
But I've heard you make reference to what I consider kind of the elephant in the room. You're at Johns Hopkins.
Yep.
This term, DEI,
It's a little controversial, yeah.
what's happening?
At Johns Hopkins? Okay.
And if you'd rather not answer, I understand.
Yeah. So, okay. I'm trying to think, like, what am I supposed to say in this moment? So, okay. So, I'm not a lawyer, and so I'm not giving you the legalistic answer. I'm giving you the sort of general parameters. My understanding of the current situation is that the current the Trump administration has ruled out, admissions or any kind of work that gives favor to any subgroup, period. And so that includes giving preferential admissions to communities of color or low-income students or different, or not low-income, but certainly race-based admissions are sort of ruled out. And so what that means is that what universities like Hopkins are having to do is to re-examine all of their processes to make sure that there are no kind of race-based favors that are given, and that it's merit-based admissions and all of these different kinds of things. It also means that there's, because of the whole situation with the crisis in the Middle East, there's a lot of controversy around how we handle things like anti-Semitism and other kind of groups like that. And so what a lot of universities like Hopkins are doing, I think, is saying that we as a university remain very committed to trying to be a place where people of all kinds can come to our university, right? And that includes conservatives and liberals and white people and black people and poor kids and rich kids and Jews and Arabs and everybody. And I think that is true. And the university is working very hard to figure out how they can continue to build that community in a way that is consistent with the current law. So, how was that? Hunter, my husband, who's also on faculty, is like,
I think you could do one more.
okay. How was that? Okay, yes, Carol.
Can I get back to Crossroads?
Yeah.
Because what I wonder is it as effective now, a decade
Yep.
later, when times have changed, that was post-George Floyd, now the country seems even more divided.
Yes.
I'm aware of undivided success from some people I know, and my kids are your age and are involved, but I don't know whether
Okay. So I mean, the short answer is it depends on what you mean by effective. So Crossroads continues to grow, you know, so they have, in the time period since the book was published, they went from 35,000, the book came out last year, and so actually the time period from when I stopped writing the book, which is probably a few years before that, you know, so over the last like 3 or 4 years, they went from 35,000 to 50,000. So they continue to grow, which means they're drawing a lot of people in. I don't have the exact data, but if I were to sort of just to say anecdotally based on my visits to Crossroads, I do think that the community continues to kind of struggle with political diversity, not so much because there's anything unique to Crossroads, but because like politics has gotten that much more conflictual in the United States. But that being said, the founding pastor of Crossroads is a man named Brian Tome, he mostly doesn't want people to know his politics, but if I had to guess, and I don't know this for sure, I think his politics probably lean to the right. He named his successor pastor, who right now is a man named Kyle Ranson, who's probably like, you know, maybe in his 40s or something like that. And Kyle's also white. Kyle's politics lean, I think, again, I don't know for sure, but definitely lean left. And Kyle is very committed to continuing the work of anti-racism within Crossroads. So part of what Kyle did is, you know, as Crossroads kind of had this like back and forth relationship with Undivided, Kyle, when he was named as a successor pastor, he essentially worked to bring Undivided closer into the fold of the church. And so he's working, you know, even as the community is changing and grappling with all the politics of the current moment, he's working really hard to kind of like bring that in. Undivided as a program did what was common to a lot of church programs that come out of a church like Crossroads, is it spun off into its own nonprofit, which wasn't like a contentious thing. That's just what a lot of what Crossroads does. So it's now its own independent nonprofit organization, and it continues to work in Crossroads, but also works in other mega churches and other small churches around the country. And so there's a big mega church in Michigan, there's one in Texas, there's one in Alabama that it's doing a lot of work with, and so it continues to do work. It also has developed programs where it works in some non-church communities. So it did a really interesting session in a local town in suburban Ohio where it had the police force and local civic leaders kind of go through Undivided together. And I had this like fascinating conversation with the police chief, who was a person who was white, who brought that program in. And I could have written a whole different book just about the experience of the police community. So it continues to do work, but it's not completely even, and that's true both within Crossroads and elsewhere. Is like it's not a formula, but it's an approach and it's an attitude to trying to inspire people to doing work in a different way. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
Great. Okay.
Very, very much.
Yeah.
I don't know whether they did this 10 years ago. Steve, maybe you remember. Of course. Okay. The reward is this
Thank you.
a gallon, I think it is, of maple syrup for you.
This is what my kids get for sitting through an hour of their mom. So, maple syrup. Thank you.
And as I was standing there, I looked at the cover of Undivided, where she has a copy of in her hand, and it's a picture of a white hand and a black hand meeting like that. And if you could keep that image in mind, if you have a chance to look at the flowers, just take a look and see. It's obvious that Bonnie at Coles actually looked at at Harrie's online footprint and based her arrangement on that idea. So now my job is simply to say thank you for coming, and also to ask that you might have questions still. There's plenty of time to work on those over at the reception, which I hope you'll join. And so I'm going to end on time, I hope. The forum is now ended. See you at the reception.